The blizzard hit with a fury that turned the mountains white in seconds. And Julian Vane had exactly enough time to see the headlights pierce through his gate before the world disappeared into chaos. He'd been reviewing case files when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. The sky turned the color of old bruises. The wind came howling down the valley like something ancient and hungry, and the snow didn't fall so much as it attacked. Horizontal and blinding and deadly. Then she appeared at his door. Elena Thorne stood on his threshold in a red dress that had no business being worn in a mountain storm, her hair whipping wild around her face. In one trembling hand, she clutched a contract. In the other, her car keys, useless now that her vehicle was already buried under 2 feet of powder. "Julian," she gasped, pressing the document against his chest. "I need your signature. Please. They're coming for me." Julian stared at the woman who destroyed his life 3 years ago. The woman whose testimony had branded him a fraud and sent him into exile in this fortified cabin. The woman who'd climbed the corporate ladder, using his ruined reputation as stepping stones. "Get out," he said. "I can't." She glanced over her shoulder at the white chaos consuming everything. "And neither can you. Not for 5 days." The power failed then, plunging them into the glow of the city lights far below, lights that were already beginning to flicker and die as Silver Ridge lost its grip on civilization. Julian recognized what was happening. This wasn't just a snowstorm. This was a killer blizzard, the kind that buried entire towns and wasn't discovered until spring thaw revealed frozen secrets. Elena pushed past him into the cabin, bringing the cold with her. "You think I betrayed you? Julian, I saved you. And now I need you to save me, or we're both dead before this storm ends." Outside, the wind howled like judgment itself. Inside, the woman he hated most in the world held a contract that would either redeem him or finish what she'd started. The 5-day sentence had begun. But what Julian didn't know was that Elena hadn't come to be saved. She'd come to warn him that the blizzard was the perfect cover for something far more deadly than the cold. ***. Subscribe now to find out what secret Elena is hiding and why an entire town wants it buried under the snow. Comment below with the country you're watching from, and may your next 5 days bring unexpected fortune instead of blizzards. The truth is about to be uncovered. Will you be there when it happens? Julian had been watching the sky darken for an hour before Elena's Mercedes crawled up his mountain road. He recognized the car immediately. Same model she'd driven when they'd worked together at Castellan and Marks, back when his signature had meant something besides exile and disgrace. The wind was already picking up, bending the pines at unnatural angles. Julian's weather station showed the temperature plummeting, the barometric pressure dropping like a stone thrown into a well. Every instinct screamed at him to lock the door and let her freeze, but even he wasn't that far gone. She emerged from the car in that ridiculous red dress, heels sinking into snow that was already ankle-deep. The contract was clutched against her chest like armor, her other hand gripping a leather portfolio that the wind tried to tear away. "Julian," her voice barely carried over the rising howl. "Please, I need." The rest was lost as the first real gust hit, a wall of white that swallowed her car whole. Julian grabbed her arm and hauled her inside, and even that brief exposure left ice crystals forming on his beard. The door slammed shut with the finality of a vault closing. Elena stood dripping on his hardwood floor, shivering so violently the papers in her portfolio rattled. Up close, he could see the terror in her eyes. Real terror, not the calculated kind she'd worn in the boardroom when she dismantled his career piece by careful piece. "You have 30 seconds to explain why you're here," Julian said, "before I throw you back out." She thrust the contract at him. "They're going to kill me, and you're the only one who can." The lights went out. Through the window, the city lights of Silver Ridge below flickered once, twice, then surrendered to the dark. The backup generator kicked in with a mechanical growl, but Julian kept it low, just enough for the security monitors and essential heat. In the dim emergency lighting, Elena's face looked ghostly, her red dress like a wound against the darkness. "Give me the contract," Julian demanded. Not until you agree to help me. Then freeze. He turned toward the reinforced door that led to his archive room, where 3 years of evidence against Castellane and Marks waited in fireproof cabinets. Julian, wait. Elena's heel caught on the rug as she lunged after him. The storm, how long will it last? He glanced at the weather monitor. The numbers were apocalyptic. Wind gusts at 70 miles per hour. Temperature at 15 and dropping. Snowfall rate at 4 inches per hour with no sign of stopping. 5 days, he said flatly. Maybe 6 if we're unlucky. Her face went white. 6 days? Julian, they'll think I succeeded. She stopped, realizing she'd said too much. They'll think you succeeded at what? He moved closer, predator instinct kicking in. What exactly were you supposed to accomplish by coming here? Elena backed against the wall, the contract crinkling in her grip. I need you to sign this. It's a transfer of assets, a confession that. Julian ripped the document from her hands with such force that pages scattered across the floor. She cried out, dropping to her knees to gather them, but he was faster. He snatched up the contract and held it beyond her reach. Let me guess, he said, scanning the dense legal text. You were supposed to get me to sign away my evidence, discredit everything I've spent 3 years collecting. And in return, what? They let you keep your corner office. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Julian walked to the fireplace, where logs crackled. I understand you sold me out once, and now you're trying to finish the job. No. Elena scrambled to her feet, genuine panic flooding her voice. Julian, if you burn that contract, we both die. That's not what you think it is. Outside, the wind screamed like something trying to claw its way inside. The cabin shuddered but held firm. Julian had built it to withstand anything nature could throw at it. The question was whether it could withstand 5 days, trapped with the woman who destroyed him. He held the contract over the flames, watching her face. Then you'd better start telling me the truth. 3 years ago, Julian Vane had been the best forensic investigator Castellane and Marks had ever employed. He'd uncovered embezzlement schemes, exposed corporate fraud, and saved the firm's clients millions in potential losses. His reputation was impeccable, his methods unorthodox but effective, and his partnership track was guaranteed. Then he'd made the mistake of investigating the wrong people. It started with a routine audit of Silver Ridge Development Corporation, a firm client that had been acquiring mountain properties at suspicious prices. Julian noticed the pattern immediately. Properties condemned for safety violations that were later purchased at a fraction of their value by shell companies connected to Silver Ridge's town council. He brought his findings to the senior partners. 48 hours later, Elena Thorne had been assigned as his assistant on the case. She'd been brilliant, he remembered bitterly, sharp enough to understand the evidence, charming enough to make him trust her, and ruthless enough to document everything he said in private. Every theory, every assumption, every moment of doubt he'd expressed about the strength of his case. When the town council hired Castellane and Marks to defend them against Julian's allegations, Elena's testimony had been devastating. She'd portrayed him as obsessed, paranoid, willing to fabricate evidence to support his conspiracy theories. She'd taken his professional doubts, the natural questions any investigator asks, and weaponized them into proof of instability. The firm had quietly let him go with a settlement that included a strict NDA. Elena had been promoted to senior investigator, taking over his caseload and his office. Julian had retreated to this mountain fortress with his evidence and his rage, watching from a distance as Silver Ridge continued its corrupt dealings, now with Castellane and Marks's seal of approval. And now Elena was here, in that blood-red dress, with another contract and another lie. The memory made the flames' fireplace burn hotter. By the second day, the temperature outside had hit 30 below zero. Inside the cabin, even with the generator running at minimal capacity to conserve fuel, the cold was seeping through the walls like water through cracks. Julian had given Elena his spare thermal gear, partly because hypothermia would complicate things, mostly because he couldn't stand watching her shiver in that ridiculous dress. She looked different in his oversized fleece and wool socks, smaller somehow, less like the corporate predator who dismantled his career. "We need to conserve body heat," he said matter-of-factly, pulling blankets from the storage closet. "The generator won't last 5 days at heating capacity." Elena nodded, too cold to argue. They'd barely spoken since their confrontation over the contract, which now sat on Julian's desk, still unread in full. The silence between them had weight, years of betrayal and bitterness compressed into the space of a fortified cabin. He built up the fire and arranged the blankets near the hearth. The setup was purely practical. 2 sleeping bags overlapped, shared warmth, survival protocol. Nothing more. But as they settled in, backs nearly touching, Elena spoke into the darkness. "I didn't have a choice, you know. 3 years ago." Julian's jaw tightened. "Everyone has a choice. Not when they threaten your sister." Her voice was barely a whisper. Rachel was at state, remember? Scholarship student, full ride, studying environmental law. She was going to save the world. He did remember. Elena had talked about her sister constantly, proud to the point of annoying. "Mayor Thompson's son was her TA," Elena continued. "They told me if I didn't testify against you, Rachel would be expelled for academic fraud they'd fabricate. Her entire future gone. So I made a deal. I'd give them what they wanted, and Rachel would graduate untouched." "And did she?" The pause was answer enough. "She graduated," Elena finally said. "Then she died in a hiking accident 6 months later. The official report said she fell. But Rachel was an experienced climber, Julian. She didn't just fall. Want to know what really happened to Rachel, and why it connects to the contract Elena brought? Drop a comment below if you think Julian should trust her, and subscribe to see if 5 days in a frozen fortress can thaw 3 years of lies. This is where everything changes, asterisk, asterisk. On the 3rd day, with the storm still raging and fuel reserves dwindling, Julian finally sat down to read the contract in full. Elena watched him from across the cabin, wrapped in blankets, her eyes following every movement of his face as comprehension dawned. It wasn't a transfer of assets. It wasn't a confession. It was a map. The legal language was deliberately dense, designed to bore or confuse anyone who tried to read it. But embedded in the property descriptions, hidden in the seemingly random parcel numbers and coordinates, was a complete accounting of every illegal land acquisition in Silver Ridge over the past decade. "This is brilliant," Julian muttered, cross-referencing the coordinates with his own files. "You encoded the entire conspiracy into a real estate contract." Elena moved closer. "Look at Section 12, subsection 4. He found it. Buried in the middle of a clause about mineral rights was a list of names, town officials, businessmen, judges. And next to each name, a date and a dollar amount. Payoffs," Julian breathed. "Worse than that. Keep reading." He did. The final page contained a property description for a tract of land that didn't officially exist on any county map. But Julian recognized the coordinates immediately. They matched the site of Rachel's hiking accident. "They buried her where they bury all their secrets," Elena said, her voice breaking. "On land they don't want anyone to investigate. Land they stole from a conservation trust using the same tactics they used on dozens of other properties." Julian looked up at her, reassessing everything. "Why bring this to me? If you have this evidence." "Because I can't use it," she interrupted. "I'm compromised. Everything I touch gets dismissed as revenge-seeking or emotional instability. But you?" Julian Vane, the investigator they destroyed for telling the truth? "If you bring this forward, if you survive to bring this forward, people will listen." "If I survive?" Elena's eyes were hard now, all traces of vulnerability gone. "The storm wasn't random, Julian. They seed clouds. They've been doing it for years to control snow levels for the ski resorts. But this storm? This is military-grade weather manipulation. They created a catastrophe. That's insane. Is it? Look outside. Well, have you ever seen a blizzard this precisely timed, this localized, this devastating? They knew you wouldn't leave your cabin during a storm. They knew I was coming here. And they knew that 5 days without power would kill us both, making it look like a tragic accident." Julian moved to the window. Through the white fury, He could barely make out the lights of Silver Ridge, still flickering in the valley below. The town's infrastructure was failing, just as Elena had predicted. The contract in his hand suddenly felt like what it was, evidence so damning that people would kill to bury it. "So what exactly am I signing?" he asked. "Your name on that document makes it official testimony, legally binding, admissible in court. But more than that, it triggers a dead man's switch. Copies go to the FBI, state police, and 3 major newspapers simultaneously. And if we don't survive, the switch triggers anyway. But without your signature, it's easier to dismiss as forgery." Julian looked at the contract again, at years of corruption reduced to legal jargon, at his own exile finally making sense. Elena hadn't come here to finish destroying him. She'd come here to give him a chance to destroy them all. In Silver Ridge, civilization was dying slowly in the cold. Mayor Richard Thompson stood in his home office, watching the emergency reports pile up on his desk. 3 deaths so far, elderly residents who'd lost power and heat. The roads were impassable, even for snowplows. The hospital was running on backup generators that wouldn't last another 2 days. And the storm showed no signs of weakening. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said into his satellite phone. "You said it would be contained to the mountain. You said the town would be fine." The voice on the other end was cold. "The town is acceptable collateral. The primary objective remains unchanged. People are dying, damn it. My constituents." "Your constituents are already asking questions you can't answer, Richard. Every hour this storm continues, more of them remember that Julian Vane warned them about you. More of them wonder why his crazy predictions keep coming true. When this is over, you'll have a choice. Be the mayor who survived the catastrophe, or be the mayor who caused one. Vane's death ensures the former." Thompson stared out at the white landscape burying his town. "And the woman? Elena Thorne is a loose end. She was always going to be a loose end. The storm handles both problems. And if they survive, they won't." The line went dead. Thompson set down the phone and poured himself 3 fingers of scotch, his hands shaking. He'd started this 20 years ago with a simple scheme, buying distressed properties, making a little extra money on the side. But it had grown, metastasized into something he could no longer control. The people he'd partnered with weren't local businessmen anymore. They were connected to networks that scared him, that spoke casually of weather manipulation and acceptable casualties. Outside his window, Sheriff Morrison's truck struggled through the snow, barely visible. Morrison knew everything, had helped cover up Rachel Thorne's murder, had falsified the accident report. If Julian Vane survived and talked, they'd both be finished. The irony was devastating. They'd exiled Julian to that mountain fortress to silence him, never imagining it would become the one place in Silver Ridge that could withstand their own weapon. Throughout the town, similar scenes played out in darkened homes. Councilwoman Victoria Hanson watched her pipes freeze and burst, flooding her basement office where she'd kept the real property records. Judge Callahan burned documents in his fireplace, destroying evidence of the illegal condemnations. Developer Marcus Sterling watched his investment properties, built on stolen land, suffer millions in storm damage. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful in boardrooms and courtrooms was fracturing under the weight of ice and fear. And high on the mountain, in a fortress they'd mocked as paranoid excess, Julian Vane was reading the document that would expose them all. It happened on the 4th night, when the temperature inside the cabin had dropped so low they could see their breath even huddled by the fire. Julian was rationing the last of the generator fuel, making calculations about how long they could survive if the storm didn't break. Elena was staring into the flames, her face haunted. "I didn't come here to be saved," she said suddenly. "I came to warn you." Julian looked up from his calculations. "You said that, about the storm being cover for your assassination." "Yes." She turned to face him fully. "But it's worse than that. Julian, they don't just want you dead. They need you dead before spring." "Why?" "Because of what's buried under the snow." Elena pulled out her phone, miraculously still charged, and showed him a series of photos she'd taken weeks ago. "This is the land where Rachel died. The Conservation Trust property. I hired a geological surveyor to examine it, told him I was considering it for development. The photos showed exposed rock faces, drill cores, mineral samples, rare earth elements. Julian breathed, recognizing the telltale striations. Enough to be worth billions, Elena finished. That's what this has always been about. Not just corrupt land grabs for profit, but systematic acquisition of mineral rights. Silver Ridge is sitting on one of the largest rare earth deposits in North America, and the people who know are ensuring they control it before anyone realizes what they have. She swiped to the next photo, a document marked confidential from a mining consortium based in Shanghai. The deal closes in April, but it requires clear title to 37 properties currently listed as conservation land or private ownership. Properties they've been stealing through condemnation fraud for 15 years. And I was investigating the condemnation fraud, Julian said slowly. I was getting too close to the pattern. You were about to expose the whole mechanism. So they destroyed your credibility, exiled you to this mountain, and figured you'd eventually give up or be forgotten. Elena's laugh was bitter. But you didn't give up. You kept investigating, kept gathering evidence. And then I figured out what they'd done to Rachel, and I started gathering evidence too. So they arranged for us both to die in a convenient natural disaster. Not natural, manufactured. The weather manipulation has been going on for 3 years. Julian, ever since they realized they needed to test the system. Remember the drought 2 summers ago? The flash floods last spring? All controlled, all part of perfecting their ability to weaponize weather. Julian felt ice in his veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. The contract contains evidence of the mineral rights fraud, yes. But more than that, Elena met his eyes. It contains proof of the weather manipulation. Satellite data, atmospheric readings, chemical analysis of snow samples showing cloud seeding compounds. Everything. That's why they sent me to get it back. They thought I'd crack under pressure, lead them straight to my evidence. But you encrypted it into legal language and brought it to the one person in Silver Ridge who'd understand what it meant. The one person who'd believe me. The one person whose fortress might actually withstand their storm long enough to get the truth out. The wind hammered the cabin, a furious assault that had been continuous for 96 hours. Julian thought about the mockery he'd endured building this place, the accusations of paranoia, the suggestions of mental instability. They'd called him crazy for building a fortress against weather disasters. They'd been mocking him for preparing to survive their own weapon. If we sign this contract and trigger the dead man's switch, Julian said carefully, we're declaring war on some very powerful people. We're already at war. They're just trying to make sure we don't survive it. Elena stood, wrapped in blankets, looking like some ancient oracle. The question is whether we die quietly in this storm, or whether we make enough noise on the way out that the truth can't be buried with us. Julian looked at the contract, then at the woman who destroyed his career to save her sister, who'd spent 3 years gathering evidence while pretending to serve the enemy, who'd driven into a killer blizzard to give him one chance at redemption. He picked up a pen. Let's make some noise. The storm broke on the 6th day, exactly as the weather models predicted it would, not because nature was finished, but because whoever was controlling it had decided the job was done. Julian stood at his cabin door, looking out at a world transformed. Snow lay in drifts 20 feet high in places, sculpted by wind into alien shapes. The road was invisible. The city lights of Silver Ridge below were dark, completely dark, for the first time in the town's 100-year history. Elena appeared beside him, still wrapped in his thermal gear. Think we can make it down? We don't have a choice. Julian shouldered his pack, weighted with copies of the contract, encrypted drives, and 3 years of evidence. The dead man switch triggers in 12 hours if we don't check in. I'd rather deliver this in person. They set out on snowshoes, following the buried road by memory and GPS. The journey took 6 hours through snow so deep in places they had to rope themselves together to avoid losing each other. But Julian had prepared for this too. His fortress had included winter survival gear that would have seemed excessive to anyone who wasn't expecting to fight their way through a manufactured apocalypse. Silver Ridge emerged from the white like a corpse revealed by melting snow. Buildings collapsed under ice weight. Cars buried to their roofs. Power lines down everywhere. And in the streets, people moving slowly, shell-shocked, trying to comprehend what had happened to their town. Julian and Elena headed straight for the town hall, where emergency response was supposedly coordinating from backup generators. They found Mayor Thompson in his office, looking like he'd aged 20 years in 6 days. "You're alive," Thompson said, and the resignation in his voice told Julian everything. Disappointed, Julian dropped his pack on the mayor's desk. "I brought you something. A contract. Very interesting reading, if you look past the legal language." Thompson's face went gray. "Julian, listen." "No, you listen." Elena stepped forward, and her voice cut like the wind outside. "You killed my sister. You destroyed Julian's career. You corrupted an entire town's government for mineral rights you planned to sell to foreign interests. And you manufactured a weather disaster to cover your tracks." Sheriff Morrison appeared in the doorway, hand on his weapon. But Julian was faster, pulling out his phone and holding it up. "I wouldn't," Julian said calmly. "Right now, copies of everything we have are sitting in a queue, ready to send to federal authorities, newspapers, and about 50 lawyers. We don't check in within the hour. They get automatically delivered. You shoot us, you guarantee your own destruction. Or you could let us walk out of here," Elena added. "Let us deliver this evidence in person to the FBI field office in Missoula. Let them investigate properly. Let the truth come out in court instead of in a bloodbath." Thompson slumped in his chair. Morrison's hand dropped from his weapon. In their faces, Julian saw the recognition of defeat, the understanding that their conspiracy had finally outgrown their ability to contain it. "How many people died in your storm?" Julian asked quietly. "How many elderly residents froze? How many people with medical conditions couldn't reach help?" "7, Thompson whispered. "7 confirmed. Maybe more we haven't found yet." "7 murders," Elena said. "Added to Rachel's. Added to everyone you've displaced over 15 years of fraud. That's your legacy, Richard." Julian picked up his pack. "The fortress you mocked saved 2 lives. Your civilization killed 7. Remember that when they ask you why you did it." They walked out into the frozen town, toward Morrison's truck that still ran, toward the highway that was slowly being cleared, toward testimony that would dismantle Silver Ridge's corrupt foundation one revelation at a time. Behind them, Thompson sat in his office, surrounded by the ruins of his conspiracy, and reached for the phone to call his lawyer. The truth had survived the winter. 3 months later, Julian stood on his cabin porch, watching the spring thaw reshape the mountain. The media had called it the Silver Ridge Scandal. 15 years of corruption exposed, dozens of indictments, a rare earth mining scheme unraveled before it could close. Mayor Thompson, Sheriff Morrison, Councilwoman Hanson, Judge Callahan, all facing federal charges. The conspiracy had reached beyond Silver Ridge to state politicians, mining executives, even foreign nationals involved in the rare earth deal. And at the center of it all, Julian Vane's fortress, the paranoid hermit's cave that had become a symbol of preparedness, integrity, and survival. Elena appeared beside him, holding 2 cups of coffee. She'd been staying in the cabin while giving testimony, while dealing with lawyers, while slowly processing the grief of her sister's vindicated but still dead memory. "Castellane and Marks called," she said. "They want to offer you a senior partnership. Full restoration of your reputation. Back pay for 3 years, the works." "What did you tell them?" "That you'd consider it after they finish investigating which of their senior partners knew about the Silver Ridge scheme." Elena smiled grimly. Amazing how cooperative they've become since the FBI started looking at their files. Julian sipped his coffee, looking out at the valley where Silver Ridge was slowly recovering. The storm damage would take years to fully repair. The legal battles would drag on even longer. But the truth was out, documented, impossible to bury. "The town council wants to buy your fortress," Elena continued. "Turn it into an emergency shelter. They're calling it the McKenna Protocol now, building resilient structures that can withstand extreme weather events. I'm keeping the cabin. I know, but they want you to consult. Design more of them. Train people in survival preparation. She paused. They're realizing that what they called paranoia was actually the only sane response to the dangers they created. Julian thought about that, about how his exile had positioned him perfectly to become the one person who could survive to tell the truth, about how Elena's betrayal had actually been a desperate attempt to save the only family she had, about how the fortress built from rage and isolation had become the town's salvation. "What about you?" he asked. "What's next for the woman who brought down Silver Ridge?" Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the snow melt into streams that would feed the valley below. "I was thinking I might stay for a while. Help with the rebuilding. Make sure the conservation lands Rachel fought for actually get protected this time. There's a spare room." "I noticed." She glanced at him, something complicated in her expression: gratitude, grief, possibility. "Think we can survive sharing this fortress now that the immediate danger is over?" Julian considered the question. 3 years ago, he would have said no. 6 days ago, he would have said never. But the blizzard had exposed more than corruption. It had revealed that survival sometimes meant trusting the last person you expected to trust. "We survived 5 days trapped together in a killer storm," he said finally. "How hard can the aftermath be?" They stood together on the porch of the fortress that had saved them, watching spring return to the valley, watching a town learn the difference between civilization and survival, watching truth slowly thaw out from under years of buried lies. Below, Silver Ridge began again, and high on the mountain, in the cabin everyone had mocked. 2 survivors prepared to ensure that the secrets exposed by the blizzard would never be buried in darkness again. The fortress had proven its worth, and so had the people who'd trusted in truth enough to weather the storm. This is the end of Julian and Elena's story, but it doesn't have to be the end of discovering tales of survival, secrets, and redemption. Subscribe now so you never miss another story where the truth survives against all odds. Comment below. What would you do if you discovered your entire town was built on lies? Your next great story is just one click away.